tonight, I suppose, I myself, just to give you a quick introduction, my name is Pat Ryan. I'm a director on the IJCC board. I came to Japan for the second time last year, but I previously came to Japan in 1992 and spent 4 years in northern Japan. I'm not a jet myself, but I sometimes felt like one because I was living in a very remote region of Japan. And any Japanese I met asked me two questions usually. First question was, "Are you American?" Which I replied, "No, I'm Irish." Which they replied, "That's a very cold place." And I said, "No, that's Iceland." The second question usually was, "Are you a jet or an English teacher?" And at that time, I wasn't an English teacher. But the one thing that really positive came out of the jet program for me was I bumped into an American jet on a small local train in northern Japan, and he introduced my wife to me. So that's my connection with jets, besides working closely with a number of them now on the IJCC board and across the wider community in Japan. As I say, I'm not an expert on the JET program, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a brief background to it. And I think this answers one of the questions that we got during the registration process, just to talk about what the JET program, which is the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program, is. The JET program started in 1987 with 4 countries actually participating. And in 1988, actually, Ireland started participating. So it's 33 years since it started. At the moment, there's over 5,000 participants in the program, and there's 114 Irish participants, actually. 109 are what are called ALTs, which is Assistant Language Teacher, and we have 9 CIRs, which is the other role, which is a Coordinator for International Relations. And the JET program essentially was set up by the Japanese government to encourage international exchange in local communities around Japan by bringing foreigners to those communities to work in the high schools, the junior high schools, the primary schools, the local government offices as well, in the CIR role. There's also actually, interestingly, I didn't realize it until I did a bit of research, but there's also a third role, which I think is related to exchange in the area of professional sports, but very few participants in that area. So I suppose the program is geared for college graduates around the world. There's 57 countries participate at the moment, and over the last 33 years, there's been over 70,000 people take part in the JET program. I think from a results point of view, the Japanese government's view is mixed sometimes, in that it's not always seen as ensuring that every child in the country can speak fluent English, but where it has been very successful is it gives all the participants a really, really good understanding of Japanese culture. All participants as well are working in an environment where it's usually, they're usually the only foreigner or maybe one other foreigner in that environment. So it really gives deep exposure to all the participants in culture, involvement in the local communities, and promoting their own country and this international spirit in the communities. As I say, our 6 panelists tonight are a lot more experienced and will answer all of the questions that you have later. So I suppose just we'll kick off now with the speakers tonight. So first of all, I'd like to say we have 6 extremely experienced speakers. You may have seen from the registration process, but in diverse careers as well. We have Sam Annesley, who's Executive Director, Greenpeace Japan. We have Sarah Hickey, who's Marketing Manager at Whisk-e. We have Joe Moore, who's the Marketing Manager of Japan and Korea at Board BIA. And we have Ray Meenan, who's the Senior Manager for Equity Derivatives Japan at GFI Group. We have Owen Flavin, Third Secretary of the Embassy of Tokyo, Embassy of Ireland in Tokyo, and we have John Blakeney, who's the Manager of Capital Markets for EY Japan. Sorry, I had to read some of those. I couldn't remember all those titles. I could get the names just about. So without further ado, we're going to share the screen. The participants then are going to introduce themselves and talk about their experience for about 5 minutes each. What we're going to do then is we'll have a Q&A session at the end of this, and we also have some questions that have come in during the registration process. But as we start the Q&A session, we can all unmute our screens, and if you wish to ask a question, then you can just having difficulty with that. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Sam to kick off. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks to IGCC as well for this event tonight. I think it's going to be really interesting. Yeah, it's great to be here and talk with you all. So I'll stick to my 5 minutes, and as much as possible, I'll try to just not just talk about myself, but also talk a little bit about what I think might be useful for people who are looking to transition after the JET program in a career in Japan, or who are coming into Japan and looking for some opportunities here. So I'm originally from Tyrone in the north, from a place called Japan. But I actually first came to Japan in 2001 for high school on an exchange program. So I haven't lived in Ireland since I was 17, actually. But when I came on the JET program in 2007, I was placed in Iga city, which is in Mie Prefecture, and I stayed there for 2 years as a CIR. So it's great to see there's some CIRs in the call tonight as well. And I previously lived in Mie for university, so that's why I chose to go back there. I thought it was a great place to have 2 years on JET. As for how I made the transition out of JET and into where I am today, being perfectly honest, I didn't have a clear idea about what I wanted to do. So I just took advantage of the opportunities that arose. And I'd previously studied at university in Japan in Mie, and when I finished up on JET, the university reached out to me and asked me if I'd be willing to come back as a member of staff, which I did, and I was there for a few years, which was great. But I actually was going to pack up my life here and move back to Ireland, and I was going to study medicine at Belfast, because I thought I don't know what I want to do with my life. So usually you think about studying law or medicine. So that was the plan. And then in the meantime, when I had about 6 months of time to kill between ending my job in Japan and starting University at Queen's, I found the opportunity to volunteer with a Japanese NGO called Peace Boat, which has volunteer English language teachers and Japanese English interpreters on global voyages that sail around the world. So I thought that's a great way to kill the time before starting uni. So I volunteered with Peace Boat. I got hooked, and then I gave up on studying medicine and decided to become a full-time staff member at Peace Boat instead. So I stayed there for about 5 years and had a really interesting time doing lots of traveling with Peace Boat. But I decided that I wanted to transition into a more kind of substantial career, not just in terms of financial security, but also kind of looking for new challenges. So I actually ended up working for Bloomberg as a financial analyst. I got an entry-level position there. Tried it for a while, found it was not for me, and then I transitioned back into the nonprofit sector. Since then, I've worked in a few different NGOs, and now I'm the executive director at Greenpeace in Japan. In terms of what I benefited from the JET program, there was no direct benefit in terms of hard skills from the job itself. But I think the most valuable thing from the JET program is having that insight that Pat touched on, with like insight into the Japanese working culture, which really is invaluable. And being able to navigate your way through that is something that will get you far in Japan. I also learned an appreciation for the inaka, for the countryside of Japan. I think for most of us, if we're keen on pursuing careers, most of us will end up in either Kansai or in Kanto, and it's easy to forget that there's this beautiful country outside of Tokyo or Osaka. In terms of, I think, what would be useful for those of you who are thinking of transitioning out of JET or transitioning into Japan, I would say in my personal experience and the experience of my friends that I know, that Japan is, it's a really easy place, and it's a great place to build a fantastic career, a very good quality of life. But you need to put in the effort, like with anything. And I say there's two main ingredients behind that. First of all, before anything else, I would say language. Japanese, if you want to get far in Japan, is really essential. So if you're serious in really, building your career in Japan, I would say aim for N1 of the JLPT. You don't have to have it next year or the year after that, but in my experience, I would say that will really open a lot of doors. I know many friends that are incredibly experienced, very well talented, very skilled, but didn't have solid Japanese, which meant that they unfortunately had glass ceiling. And so with Japanese, you can pretty much pick any career path that I think that you would like to pursue. The second thing I think, which is really important in addition to language, is leveraging your networks, making personal connections. I think they're absolutely key. So I think that IJCC is a great example of that. There's also JMEC, the Japan Market Expansion Competition. So I'd say leverage your uniqueness, because you're a native speaker of English, you understand Japanese culture, and those two are very valuable qualities to have. And if there's anything else I can share, I'd be happy to talk to anyone later on. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Sam. I think your point about the Inaka, which is the countryside, is very valid. Anybody who I've met who has lived in remote countryside of Japan, you build up a resilience and an adaptability, and I think that stands to anybody in their career in the future, because you are surrounded and fully immersed in the culture, and if you can survive and thrive in that, it really sets you up for future unexpected challenges in your career. That's a really good point. So I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, and we're going to hear from Sarah Hickey.
Thanks for that. So I graduated, so my name is Sarah Hickey. I'm from Killarney, County Kerry in Ireland. I came to Japan on the JET program in 2008 after graduating in UCC. Prior to the JET program, I had zero knowledge of Japanese language or culture. I was based in Iwakishi in Fukushima, where I worked as an ALG in several junior high schools. In 2011, I decided not to renew my contract and go back to university. But soon after, the earthquake struck Japan, and Fukushima was one of the areas which was very badly affected. So I decided to stay on, and I devoted my time to teaching and volunteering for a year and a half in Fukushima, and also Minami-Soma, and also Miyagi-kin. So this was the real turning point for me, as many of my expat friends left during the time. So I started to really immerse myself in the Japanese language and culture and in the local community in Iwaki. And I found this to be the most effective, much more effective than the traditional, and my language skills started to develop quite quickly. I also used that time to travel to Tokyo on the weekends and started to network with many different kind of groups of people and to find out what the job market was like here in Tokyo. So in early 2012, I started to really think, well, what should I do following JET? But I had in my heart, I felt I wanted to stay in Japan, but I also wanted to be somehow connected with Ireland. So I guess my approach was something very similar to the JET program, which was promoting grassroots internationalization, but more in the business world. So I did a lot of research on Irish brands which were investing in developing their business in the Japanese market. And so at the time, Irish whiskey brand Jameson was experiencing double-digit growth internationally. So I reached out to somebody working on the brand team in Tokyo, and I arranged a meeting. So during our meeting, I discovered that Japan was a priority market for the brand, and that they were expanding their team in Tokyo as well as globally. So I applied for a position. So after a series of interviews, I got offered a role which saw me spending time training in Ireland at the distillery in Middleton, and also with the Irish Distillers marketing team in Dublin. So I didn't, I was based in Ireland for about a half a year, and then they sent me back to Japan as like an expat, and I was working in the Pernod Ricard office in Tokyo, where I worked with the local team in developing the brand, which was a fantastic experience. It gave me great insight into the Japanese business environment, the fast-moving consumer goods industry and marketing world, which I thoroughly enjoyed and still do enjoy very much. So I decided to stay in Tokyo and to work long term. And then I moved to the marketing team in Bacardi, Japan, where I spent almost 5 years. And over 2 years ago, I joined Whisk-e, one of the leading spirit import companies, as their marketing manager, where I'm now managing a team of 10 people, all of whom are Japanese. Maybe 20% speak English. So as somebody coming, not having studied Japanese in university, or and also I taught myself to study. So I don't necessarily think you need to go to university and graduate in Japanese studies to be successful here. I think it's much more than language that it takes to succeed here, but it is very, very beneficial and very necessary. But it's also understanding the Japanese culture and way of working and networking, and really adapting yourself to the business environment here. So my advice to anybody who is transitioning careers in Japan is to not be afraid to dive into the unknown, look inward and seek your passion and what your real interest is, and explore your options and reach out to as many people as you can. As I really believe that connections are really key for developing your career here in Japan. And don't be afraid, because I think everything is possible here. So I could keep going on, but I will be happy to chat and give advice to anybody later on if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think the point that you made, I think that decision you made to stay after the earthquake in Fukushima was a huge decision, and has probably shaped your career and lots of things in your life. So anybody who's on the call tonight and they're unsure on whether they should make that decision to go to Japan or not, or whether they should make that decision to study Japanese or not, or apply for the JET program, then I think if you make those big decisions, it's very rare that you regret those decisions. If you come and work anywhere internationally, whether it's Japan or globally, it'll always benefit your career. So again, really good story, Sarah, and thank you for that. On the language side of things as well, like Sarah, I never studied the language in college. And as Sam said, it's really beneficial if you're fluent in the language, but it's not 100% necessary. And I know some people who came to Japan with no Japanese and took to the language very quickly and are now fluent in it. So it's how much work you decide to put in to that. So we'll move on now, and as I say, we can have discussions during the Q&A and all these topics. So we'll move on to our next speaker now, Joe Moore, and Joe will tell us his story and give us some insights. Thanks, Joe.
Hi guys, how's it going? Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you
I'm
perfectly.
dialing in off my phone, my Wi-Fi dropped. I'm delighted to chat with you today. Really glad to join the event, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, and quite humbled to be speaking alongside these very distinguished speakers. I feel like I'm still young myself and I haven't achieved that much, but I'm glad to talk through my experience so far and talk openly, and hopefully it's interesting and useful, and looking forward to answering questions and having a chat as well. So I was in Kashiwazaki in Niigata for 3 years, from 2010 to 2013. I didn't know anything about Japan before coming. I didn't study Japanese either, but I got really into the language and the culture straight away, and my time on JET ended up as being 3 years. At that time, I didn't know where my career was going, and similar to Sam, I didn't have a grand plan at all to still be connected to Japan 10 years later. But after finishing up on JET, I was lucky enough to be given the job in the Embassy of Japan, coordinating the JET program applications, promoting the program, and managing the hiring for that year. And while I was in Dublin for that year, the Irish government decided that they wanted to improve the scientific relationship with Japan, and through Science Foundation Ireland, they set up a grant to help nurture science research relations, and I applied to manage that program and took up a job in NUI Galway for 3 years, and as part of that I was organising events and managing, I suppose, government interactions around science. I visited Japan, I think, about 10 times in 3 years, and it was kind of during that time I started to move towards a more Japan-focused career, I suppose. I finished up in NUIG in 2017 and wanted to do something by myself. At that time, I'd been in a few jobs, but was interested in the world of business. And I set up an event which hopefully some of you have heard about, called JCon, Japanese anime and manga and culture and language and all of that. And I organised that event in Croke Park Stadium from 2017. We had a first edition with about 1,500 people in 2017, and I've held it twice since then. We had about 1,800 people last year, which was incredible. And during that time, I started to look for other jobs, and last year, or 2 years ago now, I found out that Board Beer was looking to hire in Japan and looking to open an office here. And I applied and again was lucky enough to be given that job, and I've been with Board Beer managing, so Board Beer, as you probably know, promotes the exports of Irish food and drink around the world, and the Japan market is growing very significantly at the moment, and I'm managing the Board Beer office from within the embassy here in Tokyo. And one more thing that I'll mention as well is that while I was managing JCon, I was also lucky enough to do some interpretation for Japan Rugby under-19s and under-20s, and joined the Japan under-20s for the Junior World Cup in France, which was an incredible experience. And I suppose to echo some of the points that have been mentioned already, networking is definitely key. But if I'm honest, I'm terrible at networking in the big room and all the business cards. It's not something I excel at, but I would say that what I've managed to do at times is network through doing things. For example, my opportunity with the rugby came about through a relationship with a Japanese woman in Dublin, and I knew her through emceeing the Experience Japan festival. It was something they were looking for, somebody who was willing to take up the job of emceeing Experience Japan, which happens in Phoenix Park in April. And I put my hand up, and through that, that opportunity came about for me. And again, with Board Beer, although it was an open recruitment, obviously, my link to Board Beer came through knowing a woman called Fiona Oyema, who you might be aware of. She herself was in ex-JET and also was in Niigata, and she's got a cookbook and several awesome soy sauce and other food products in Ireland. And it was through knowing her that I got connected to the manager in Board Beer in Dublin, who was looking to find someone for Japan. So although I wouldn't be much of a networker in terms of the big room, always keeping busy outside of my job, I find has really lent itself well towards finding the next step. And Yeah, so that's my career in a nutshell. And I suppose the other thing I would say is that I haven't mentioned at all about all the fails and all the job applications that I made that I didn't get, because there have been loads of them. And I suppose my point is that I've tried to always keep busy. I hate the word hustle, but tried to always keep busy and hustle on the job applications and the networking and trying to find opportunities. And having been on both sides of the interview desk, you realize that there's a lot of luck and a lot of fit in terms of finding jobs. And so you have to apply lots, keep applying, keep on trying to find the next gig. And I would definitely recommend anybody looking to kickstart their career post-jet to keep busy. So I'll finish there before I start talking too long, and look forward to chatting with you after. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Joe. Really interesting. 2 points there that I find really interesting is your connection with Japan. Many people who come to Japan, end up, even if they go back to Ireland or they go to another part of the world, they have this connection back to Japan. So I think the Japanese culture and the people have a way of getting embedded in your whole being. And I know people who only spend 3 to 4 years here, but they still have lifelong connections here. The second thing I think around the networking, which is important for people to know, and I don't really know, Joe, how shy you are at networking, but I'll take it at face value. You're well able to do it. But I think the Japanese themselves generally like to have structure around networking as well. So getting involved in social events, getting involved in clubs outside of your work, or any hobbies you want to try out, that's really appreciated in Japan. And with Joe, you obviously, it's led to big events across a whole range of areas. I think the one thing that when I came to Japan first, I didn't realize, and many of you on the call may not realize either, but because you might be living in a local community, you can sometimes get a bit just focus on that area, but there's lots of networking groups outside of it, especially these days with everything online. So I'd encourage you to take that step and start networking, and tell people about your ambitions and what you'd like to do. Everybody that I've come across in this community, in the IJCC, the Irish community in general, they want to help. So if people know you need help or want some advice, just ask, and it's usually there. So I'll move on now to the next speaker, conscious of time. We'll move on to Ray and hear his story. Yeah,
can you
hear you perfect. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. Good evening. Thank you for organising. Thanks to IJJC. Pat mentioned earlier that there was 57 countries involved with JET. When I came out here, there was 8. And Joe mentioned he was one of the younger people on the call tonight. I'm definitely the oldest. July the 31st, 1989, I guess is probably one of the most important days of my life. That's the day I landed at Narita Airport with 30 other Irish jets. We're all nervous, we're all excited. And back then, the Cold War with Russia was in full swing. So initially we flew from Dublin to London, and then we left London and had to fly backwards to Alaska, where we stopped over at Anchorage before continuing on to Tokyo. Yep, as I said, I know I'm showing my age here. So it's over 31 years since I've been here. Yes, I'm still here. So you've no guarantee of your first selection. No, until I arrived in Tokyo, and we were doing the orientation at the Keio Plaza Hotel in Shinjuku, that my placement actually was of Tokyo, but it was actually going to be shipped, which are the Izu group of islands south of Tokyo. And even back then, it was an overnight ferry to get to these islands. They're considered part of Tokyo, but they're quite far from it. So rural is an understatement. Kozishima has a population of around about 2,000. And I was taken to this little Minshuku, dropped there, and I was on my own. I didn't have a word of Japanese with salads. You know, I used to dream of cornflakes. And it's funny now how Japanese breakfast is probably one of my favorites. And I'd never seen a Japanese style bath back then. And it was really interesting to me. Even the toilets were drop toilets, which basically just a hole in the ground. And here I was thinking Japan is one of the most advanced countries in the world. But one cool thing I remember, I got into my room and noticed there was towels all over the room. So every day I used to take my towel at 5 p.m., go down the stairs and go for my evening bath. And the mother of the house, she used to be waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs to try to say something to me in Japanese. But I could never understood, so I just used to smile and just to walk on. But then on the Saturday, a guest from Tokyo arrived. So they came to my room, knocked on the door with the mother of the house and said, Raymond, every day when you go to the bath, why do you take your blanket with you? I was going, blanket? It was a towel. Surely it was a towel. The largest and best towel I'd ever seen, but I didn't know about towel kits. You know, it was so hot in the summer that obviously you didn't need a futon or anything. So use a towel kit. I was so embarrassed. Shock. So I spent the first 6 months I spent in Kozishima, and then I moved to the neighboring island of Niijima, and that's where my life in Japan really started. And while I was lonely in Kozishima, Niijima, the people basically adopted me and tried to make me one of their own. You know, the kids at school were super friendly, and the boys made it their mission to teach me to surf after school. The locals would take me out to karaoke in the evening, and sometimes I'd go to school the next day, and the kids would say, hey, you were out drinking with my dad last night. I said, yeah, not much went unnoticed in Niijima. And the school I was in was very small. The classes sometimes were 6 to 10 students, as many of the students used to go into the big schools in Tokyo. So without realizing it, you know, I started to learn Japanese. Friends would visit me in Tokyo, and they would say, wow, Ray, your Japanese is quite good. And it was just a case of having to learn it rather than wanting to. I can remember even going to the local shop to buy some food, and the little lady in the shop, she used to panic every time I came in because it was just a nightmare. The only thing I could recognize was the cornflakes box. And I can remember buying a tub of peanut butter, going home making a sandwich. Turned out it was actually miso that I bought. So another day I can remember going out of the store with my shopping, and this little old lady pulled up in her scooter, grabbed the bags, and just absolutely took off. I thought I'd been mugged by a little old lady, but it turned out it was my neighbor who had told me those bags looked heavy. She took them from me, took them home, and left them with loads of fruit and food outside my house. So being able to speak Japanese was very important for me later when I moved into Tokyo and when my time in JET ended. Now back then, the JET contract was 2 years. And as my final year was about to end, they decided to extend it to 3 years. But I had to leave the island. I'm not sure why but that was the rules. So I moved into Tokyo and I was placed into Tachikawa High School. And that was a complete shock and complete difference because the schools on the island, the students, they didn't really care about studying. But in the Tachikawa High School, they were very studious. They all wanted to get to university. And, you know, they would try as much as they can to speak to me in English. They'd look for me after class. And it was a big, big change for me. I actually had to do some work for a change. You know, I could talk for hours about my life on the island. And, you know, back then, I really didn't appreciate how good it was and how much I learned from the people then. So, and when I was living on the island, all these brokers and traders from the financial markets used to come out because the island was quite famous for surfing. So they soon found out that an Irish guy was living there. So this is way before mobile phones. So they used to call the high school, ask to speak to the English teacher, and he'd get me to get into my car, drive down to the beach, and check if any surf was up. So I'd drive down, see the waves are up, call back, and I'd call back into these banks in Tokyo and say, yeah, surf's up. So they would come on a Sunday night, on a Saturday night, grab the ferry, come and crash in my place and spend the weekend with me. And I would take them around the island, do some interpretations for them. And they absolutely loved it. After I'd left the island and when my contract finished with Jet, I was out in Tokyo, I actually ran into one of these guys and he recognized me as the guy from the island. And he said, "Hey, Ray, would you be interested in coming and meet with my boss in my company?" I said, "Well, what do you do?" He said, "Well, we're brokers." Didn't have a clue what it was. So he introduced me to his Japanese boss and I did my interview in Japanese. And they were so impressed that I had lived in this tiny island and that I was a Jet teacher teaching in a school, one of these rural schools. And he offered me a job on the spot and into the financial markets. Obviously, these days with LinkedIn and with so many opportunities like IJCC to network, Jet is a huge resource for people, I think, in the recruitment industry as well. I've got many friends who are recruiters and they love to speak to Jets. Everybody keeps saying how important networking important it is. So speak to people, get to know recruiters, get to know anybody here. There's no internet, there's no mobile phones back then. It was all by word of mouth. But the most important thing, and everybody said it so far, language, I think for me was the most important one. I learned it without studying. If you got a chance and you can study, make the effort to it. For me, I learned to speak very good Japanese. To my shame, I didn't learn to read or write very well. But when you are here, do make the effort. Try to study the kanji. I know it's hard, but it'll stand to you. So again, thank you for your time, guys. Any questions afterwards, please give me a shout.
Thank you very much, Ray. That's a fantastic story. I'm sure you could tell many more, and I'm sure everybody else on the call could as well. You always have these unique experiences in the country area and in Japan in general. And I think that point around the connection and the networking, that later on it stood to you, it helped you get your start in something that you didn't even have experience in. So that's really important. So I think on the networking thing as well, I mentioned at the start of the call that because of I suppose COVID-19, we've gone online with a lot of our events, and we intend to continue after in parallel with online and in-person events. But what it also allowed us to do is get the series at the moment called Tales from the Regions. We've had Kamaishi Niwate, and we had a CIR, Aisling Barry, who gave us an update from that region. And if any of you need to reach out to Aisling, she'll again, help you connect and help you to understand the opportunities that you can get by networking both in the regions and in Tokyo. And then next week on the 7th of October, we have the second in the series, and we have Rachel Meehan down in Fukuroi in Shizuoka. And she's going to give an update there. And we have the ambassador attending and the mayor of Fukuroi City as well. So there's very many opportunities to meet your colleagues, your peers. And as I said, make sure you reach out if you have any queries or questions on how you can network prior to coming to Japan, if you're already living in Japan, or any other situation. So I'll move on now to Owen, and we'll hear Owen's story. So.
Hey everyone, hope you can hear me okay. Can you?
Yes, you're fine.
Great. Yeah. Okay, very good. Yeah, thanks for coming along. I think I know a good few of you. I've met a few of you. So I'm Owen. I work for the Department of Foreign Affairs, but I'm currently posted to the Embassy of Ireland in Tokyo. It's a 3 to 4 year posting, and I've been here for 2 years so far. So before, I used to be a Jet. I was a Jet from 2012 to 13 in Kaga City. It's not really a city, in Ishikawa Prefecture. I was there for 1 year, and to be honest, at the time, I really didn't make the most out of Jet. I didn't take Japanese lessons. I wasn't really involved in my schools. I was teaching in 9 schools, and yeah, it was a kind of, I was enjoying myself a lot as well. So I tended to go outside my very small town on weekends to big cities. So I was only there for a year, and afterwards I went traveling slightly on a whim again. I was never on whim. Maybe I wanted to work in an international context, but I never really thought about the path towards getting there. And I don't think traveling for ages was going to do it, but I was excited to see more of the region. So I set off. After a few months, I kind of realized that I did want to start to look at careers and think a little bit more seriously about it. And again, on a whim, I moved to London because I figured there'd be a lot of jobs there. So in London, which I suppose was the transition from Jet, faced with possibly existential panic because I applied for about 40 to 50 jobs, I kind of thought, well, I have a degree in philosophy and politics, and I've been to Japan for a year. Surely I'll be able to get a job somewhere. But I realized I didn't have any hard skills. I hadn't learned Japanese. You know, I hadn't done many events in my town. So there was very little I could speak to in interviews, and I only really got one interview. And that was for a small grassroots NGO, which worked with young refugees and asylum seekers. And I started an internship there while working nights in a cinema and subsequently a ramen restaurant. This is one thing that Jet was very good for. I was able to get into a ramen restaurant by bluffing on my knowledge of ramen. But I worked in a couple more grassroots NGO roles with young refugees and asylum seekers, mainly psychosocial support, kind of like a social worker almost. I also started, when I was in London, doing a part-time master's while working. That was in the political economy and development, but I specialized in East Asian and Japanese development, post-war development. And then eventually I ended up applying for the Department of Foreign Affairs, which I've been working at for the last 3 years, 2 of which I've been in the embassy here. I can talk a little bit more later about the Department of Foreign Affairs and what it is we do, but you know, it's when you join as a third secretary, which is the entry level for diplomats, you start in our headquarters for about a year or two before getting posted to a foreign location. One of the 90 odd embassies or consulates we have around the world. And Jet, in retrospect, and was extremely helpful for that and for adjusting to life here. I think Pat mentioned the skills of resilience and adaptability, these kind of qualities where you're plonked in the middle of nowhere and you kind of have to adapt. That's hugely important when you're sent abroad. You can be sent, I'm lucky, I was sent to somewhere where I had an academic and a prior experience in being sent to Japan, but some people will get sent to missions in locations where it's only 1 or 2 staff members, and it may not be their speciality, it may not be where they speak the language, and they have to adapt quite quickly. I would say that the hard skill of learning Japanese is obviously extremely valuable for working in the department. It's one of the kind of you know, prioritized languages for our department. But you know, there's the soft competencies. When you join the public service, the interviews are competency based, and a lot of it is around, you know, adaptability, communication skills, leadership. So having examples of that from working on Jet is really valuable. Leading a classroom of children or organizing events in your locality, that's exactly the type of thing that that is great for interviews, to be able to speak to. Other kind of points just about transitioning, I suppose. If people are interested in the academic route, having experience of Japan and adding to it with a postgraduate degree, with a specialism in something related to Japan is also a very good kind of path. And just for the Department of Foreign Affairs, we're actually hiring at the moment for third secretaries. So I think a link will be in the event page of this after the event. Obviously, as I say, there's no guarantee that people will end up in Tokyo, but over the course of a career with the department, it's likely that you can kind of veer towards Tokyo or even the Asia Pacific unit in our headquarters or somewhere else in the region. and it's a great job. It's you do spend a lot of time living away from home, but it's extremely interesting. And while you may not be meeting the Prime Minister of Japan every day, you know, what I do is I work on a lot of administration, citizens affairs with Irish citizens, but I do get to work on sports diplomacy and political reporting as well. So it's a very interesting kind of career path, and I'd recommend it for ex-Jets. Particularly, I think we're crying out for Japanese speakers and people with international experience. So certainly Jet is a really good base for that. I'll leave it there, but if there's any questions about the department or the current competition for hiring, just let me know.
That's great. Thank you very much, Owen. Again, I think your point on getting involved with an NGO early in your career and people's careers as well, people may not realize the importance that that can have when you're doing interviews later, but also it allows you personally to develop as well. So I think that's a really important point. On the job that you mentioned, any jobs like that as well, the IJCC will post these on our social network sites. And in general anyway, any jobs that our clients have going in Japan, we post them on our social media sites, so keep an eye out for that. Just on mentoring as well, the IJCC has a mentoring group as well for members. We've about 9 experienced mentors now, maybe 10, and we have a number of mentees as well. So if you're interested in understanding more about how you can, you know, how you can get to Japan, if you're in Japan, how you can change your career, you can join that mentorship program. It's through a kind of a private Facebook group. We'll put more details on some of these after the event as well. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us. Okay, so I'll move on now. Last but not least, we have John, and John is going to give us his story. So thanks, John.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So my name's John Blakeney. I'm currently a manager in the capital markets group with EY in Tokyo. But my degree was actually originally in geography, so I've come from a completely non-business background. And at the time, like some of the other people who've been talking before me, I had really no idea about what I wanted to do. But what I did kind of feel was I'd gone to college in my hometown of Dublin. So really, I wanted to just take on the challenge of kind of going overseas and learning a language. I just felt like that would throw me out of my comfort zone. And I knew some people who'd been on Jet, and I also happened to have some childhood friends from Japan, so it kind of seemed like a good fit. And I was fortunate. I was placed in Kamioka City, just outside Kyoto City. And it was a really good placement because I kind of had a bit of this Inaka vibe that people have been talking about. But I was also within range of Kyoto City and could get in for a bit of the nightlife there as well. So it was a good balance. The school was very welcoming as well, albeit not particularly academically strong, but it was a very good experience. And I'd actually, I stayed 2 years. I would have gladly stayed longer, but I just kind of felt like I wanted to do something different. Although I didn't have a grand plan, I kind of always felt, well, I want to be learning new skills all the time. So I kind of felt like it had run its course after 2 years. So at that point, when I was starting to think about my career transition, and I will say before I talk about my career that I wouldn't necessarily recommend my career path as an example, because it's a bit all over the place. But there's probably bits in there which other people might be interested in, any of which I'm happy to talk to you about. But the first thing I did after Jet was I applied for a scholarship from the Monbuk Hagakusho program. And that program is actually quite similar to the JET program in the manner of application. It's through the embassy, and it's actually little known and probably underrated program. It's a fully sponsored master's or even a PhD, and with a stipend as well. So you're kind of breaking even in your living. So all I did was I sent an email to the professor in Tokyo University, an urban planning professor, and he was willing to put his name to my application. And once you have the name of a good professor, then you're in pretty good shape with your application. So the my time doing a master's here itself was really, really good. It's another network, but quite different one from Jet, very international, a lot of people from other Asian countries and further afield, very, very, intellectual, clever kind of group, but also kind of all here having a good time as well. So really stimulating environment, I guess. And you're very free in what you do in terms of it's really oriented. But once I finished that once again, I got faced with this question of, right, now what are you going to do? And I felt like when I was kind of thinking about a career, I really needed to go into something which was going to give me some kind of training, which I could kind of build the rest of my career on. So I went back to essentially applied for graduate positions in Ireland. Any position which I felt like, I wasn't very specific in what I wanted to do, but I just wanted to make sure that I was getting a training. And one of the companies, as with Joe, I wouldn't want to give the impression that I got every interview that I went to, far from it. But one of the companies that I applied to was EY. It was actually a consulting role that I applied for with EY. But they ended up kind of referring me to interview with audit. There was only, I think, 3 or 4 places in consulting, very competitive. And auditing was actually called assurance. I Googled assurance the night before. I was like, okay, what's this all about? And I realized, okay, it's audit. And I kind of never really thought about being an accountant or studying accounting before, but I kind of thought about it and I was like, well, if I can work and get paid and also be getting a training at the same time, which comes out with a kind of a solid qualification afterwards, well, that seemed kind of quite appealing after all the kind of moving around that I'd done before that. And I was a bit of an outlier in auditing because I quite enjoyed it. I'm a bit of a curious mind, quite analytical. So I just like going in and understanding how all these different companies are run. Some people find it very hard, but I actually enjoyed it. So after doing that for a few years and kind of picking up my qualification, I was there for 5 years, I think, in Dublin, 5 or 6 years. And I decided I wanted to kind of experience being a professional in Japan, which I hadn't done up to that point. So I moved back here in 2017. And what I found is that the skills that I had, were very transferable, because Japanese companies more and more kind of adopting international financial reporting standards. They're looking overseas in terms of their financing and a lot of the business activities. So there's always loads of work here for foreign accountants and lawyers. Like everyone else, I would say Japanese is really helpful. It's not completely essential. Most of the content of my work, for example, is English, but really being able to project manage and deal with people in Japanese is a great help, because the accounting firms in Japan, although they're international names, are very Japanese culturally. And one thing I did think of just mentioning to people is it's not impossible that you could train here in Japan. So if you're interested in doing that, happy to chat about that. In terms of the value of JET, I would go along with everything that everyone has said. Kind of gave me an opportunity to pick up the language from scratch. I'd never, like some of the other people, I'd never studied before. And like really in terms of interviews thereafter, I think, it is a really strong narrative to be able to say you're the kind of person who's able to just up and move to Japan and get on well and, stay a year or two and really thrive in that environment. I think that's a good story, and it kind of shows that you're somebody who's probably able to fit in a lot of different places. And it gave me a bit of time, I suppose, also then just to think what I wanted to do when I grew up, which I'm still to some extent trying to figure out. And then just a couple of pieces of advice, I suppose. And again, I think it's kind of a little bit echoing what's been said before. I liked what Joe said, like do things while you're on JET, talk to people, get involved with different stuff. That's really how you build your network. It's not just the act of networking, it's doing stuff with people. That's how you build a network. And do try and learn, I think try and learn Japanese. And again, you don't have to get the whole way by the end of the JET program, but just, you do have scope while you're on JET to kind of study a little bit. So just keep chipping away in it. And then if you end up staying, you'll cover the rest of the ground and you'll get there in the end. But don't just leave it all together. That's what I'd say. And then maybe just pick up one other skill if you can. There's loads of stuff you can do online now. So that would be my recommendation. So that's all from me. I'm happy to take any questions like everyone else.
That's great, John. Thank you very much for that. A lot there, as you said, having qualifications in accounting, having the Japanese language, having all the experience, it really stands to you. I'm supposed to be moderating this and keeping everyone on time, but I haven't done a very good job. We're already well over, but we're going to jump straight into question and answers now. So we have some questions that came in previously through the registration process, but we're going to take questions from the floor first. So what I'd like everyone to do, if you wish, you can turn your camera on so it becomes a bit more interactive. You can stay on mute unless you have a question. If anybody has a question, I think you should just be able to just unmute yourself and just say your name, and maybe let us know who the question is for. If it's not for anyone in particular, then I'll ask one of the guys to, or one of the guys will take the question. So please go ahead, ask some questions. Thank you. Any questions? Okay.
Don't be shy, folks. Come on.
I have one.
Yeah, perfect. Go ahead.
Hello, this is for anyone who wants to answer it. My name's Tilly. What is the best and the worst thing about working in Japan? Very generic question, but I'm interested.
I can say the best thing about being in Japan is just being in Japan, which is a bit broad, but it's a wicked place. And I love being in Tokyo. The worst thing for me is the time difference, because I often spend, and especially since coronavirus, time on Zoom and Skype from 5 p.m., 6 p.m., 7 p.m. when
I might share as well. I guess for me, the best thing about Japan and why I'm still here 11 years later is almost every day, or you know, you're always surprised by something. It's always something interesting and new to learn, and it's a place that you can always discover and grow and get inspired. For me, especially being in the food and beverage industry, that the food and beverage, the culture here is just fantastic. The places to eat out and meet people and have different experiences, whether it's in Tokyo or when you get out of Tokyo, it's just fantastic. The worst thing, I don't know if I don't really have that many bad things to say about Japan, but it can be quite challenging to adapting to the work environment as first. But I think once you have kind of established a good relationship with your Japanese colleagues, and once there's been like trust has been earned, and it's a very rewarding environment to work in. But it takes a lot of time and effort to earn that kind of trust. So from adapting yourself to Japanese culture, the work ethic, language, and communicating in a very mindful, respectful way. So not being so direct, as they don't really like that, but just communicating in a more of an indirect and humble way. Also, I guess paying attention to detail and investing in relationship building outside of work hours. So it can be quite time consuming to put to building relationships with people. But it's definitely worth it. And always ensuring you take a humble and honest approach to work and your own personal life. But it's very, very rewarding if you can, once you develop that kind of trust and relationship with people. Sorry, I went a bit over.
No, thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you for the question as well, Tilly. Any other questions? Oh yeah, we have a question. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead there, Kieran. Yeah. Okay.
Oh no, just applauding.
Oh, you were applauding. Sorry, I thought you were trying to wave at us. No problem. Any other questions from the audience? I just feel to just say your name and ask a question. Yeah. Okay, if we don't have any, oh yeah, we have a question. Go ahead.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Oliver Kenny. I'm with Toyota Tsusho here in Nagoya. I was on the JET program in 1999 to 2002 up in Iwate. The question I have is for the gentleman from Board Via. He said that a lot of Irish exports or Irish products are becoming very, very popular in Japan now. I was wondering if you could maybe expand a little bit on that and tell us what products she feels are becoming popular and why. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. It's nice to chat, Oliver. Cheers. And maybe, I'm not too sure, Emiko and Pat, but I did a webinar with Sarah a little while ago about food and drink, and I believe that was recorded. And maybe you can go back and watch that. That would be the long answer. For the short answer, I suppose when you look at Ireland's food and drink production, the biggest sectors are meat and dairy. As you know, there are a lot of farmers in Ireland, and we produce, a world-leading amount of beef, pork, and dairy. Dairy being for Japan, cheese, and Japan imports over half of the food it consumes, and they're also very focused on a product that is safe, healthy, and stable in terms of supply and price, and that is really what we are good at. And so products that are coming out now, again, dairy is mainly cheese, and this goes into processing and turns into like cheese or tokeru cheese. Beef is also coming out, for example. Beef tongue is very popular. Japan is importing 90% of Ireland's beef tongue production, and it's used in food service and food production. And then another sector which is growing is spirits. There are a lot of new whiskey brands entering. I think that the growth in spirits is being led by Jameson, thanks to Sarah and her hard work there. But there are new brands entering the market as well, and hopefully it will continue to grow in the future. So that's a very quick recap of the food and drink. And actually, one thing I'll mention, if I can take the chance, which I forgot to mention earlier, was that Board Beer has this marketing fellowship, which is a tie-up between UCD, Board Beer, and Irish food and drink companies. And it's a master's program which is run through UCD, but in cooperation with Board Beer. And if you participate in this program, you get a master's at the same time as working on projects for specific companies. And just to mention that there will be a new intake next year, and as such, the dates for application will be from October to December, with interviews in January. So any ex-jets that might be interested in diving into the food industry, please give me a shout, and certainly look out for the fellowship application.
That's great. Thank you very much for the question, Oliver, and thanks, Joe, for that. Also, we'll check if we have the recording. Also, Sarah and I think yourself are involved in putting together a food and drinks directory as well for Ireland. So once that's available, we'll make that available to members and friends of the Chamber. Do we have any other questions? Just call out your name and say it. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. My name is Alex. Particularly for the people who went to Japan with little Japanese. I'm a Japanese student now here in Ireland, but I'm planning to go work in Japan in the future. But how did you guys build up a level of Japanese, enough to work in a Japanese business or with Japanese people who don't speak English? How do you recommend going about it? And how difficult was it for you guys?
Don't do I listened to radio. I bought myself a DS and I was doing my kanji practice and that, which is basically the same thing the kids are doing. They're kanji kente. Just going to the pub and thinking to yourself that you're not going to speak any English while you're there. Just simple things, like little challenges you set yourself so that you're learning things one by one and using them. And then actually, when you start getting into a work context, Japanese emails and actually work language can be surprisingly formulaic. So especially emails, like if you get an email, the first time you read it, you're like, what in God's name is this? Like, you've never seen anything written like that before or spoken like that before. But you just realize that you just have to do literally the same structure, and you have to write one paragraph in the middle of it, and you look like a genius. So you know, there's a lot of that kind of stuff. You know, there's a lot of structures, and once you just kind of tune into what those are, it's not as bad as you think. But obviously, the biggest challenge of Japanese by far is the kanji. And that just takes time, and it's just like doing it in different ways, using flashcards, using your iPhone. Like there's a few apps you can kind of use which give you like flashcards, writing stuff down. Always if you have to go and set up a bank account, don't write it in English, always write it in kanji. You know, just simple things like that. Just use it. Do it as much as you can. That would be my message.
Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the question. Any other questions? If we don't, I can ask one or two of the questions from the questions during registration, but if anybody has one, just feel free to ask. So we have a question here that says, did you know during the JET what field you wanted to pursue? For those who are unsure, what advice do you have? And maybe Ray, do you want to have a go at that question?
Yeah, I'll take that. When I was in JET, basically back then, 1989, 1990, I was still quite young. I was 21 years old. I had absolutely no clue what I wanted to do. I was very lucky by just happened to be, I guess, right place, right time, by meeting people from the financial markets who were actually hiring back then. The bubble in Japan had just ended, but the financial markets were still quite busy. And being on JET, and the fact that I was someone who had assimilated very easily into a rural sort of village, into a rural island, and learning a little bit of Japanese, that's what was appealing to them. I think everybody's talking about networking. It's all about networking. It's all about who you know. Use LinkedIn as much as you can. Joe mentioned, get out, meet people, talk to people. I certainly had no idea. If you don't know what you want to do, I think just make the best of it, and study the language. Everybody said, study the language.
Very good. That's good advice. We have another question here just saying, any recommendations in a situation, for students who are graduating in the current economic situation? Anybody who wishes can take that from the panel. If not, I'm going to name somebody.
I can jump in with a quick, a few thoughts on that, Pat. I think probably similar to what all of us have touched on tonight is, just take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves. I think a lot of us have kind of landed up where we are just through, taking advantage of those things that have presented themselves to us. So I'd say be curious and take advantage of those things. And, in Japan, I would say if you're already here, great. If you're thinking of coming here, brilliant. But regardless, once you get here, you really are very, very, very employable. Simply because, like I said, you have native English, you're going to have some understanding, or at least some curiosity of Japan and Japanese culture, and that will take you a long way if you're open to, taking advantage of those opportunities that present themselves.
Okay, very good. There's a question here that came in that's maybe slightly unrelated, but the question, I think the answer may be kind of relevant for everyone. So this question said, my family and I are thinking of moving to Japan in a couple of years and thinking of moving to southern Japan. What do you think we can do now to help me get a job in Japan? I'll give a quick answer to that, and then I'm sure others have an opinion as well. But I think the key is back to what we covered earlier, networking. Whether it's Ireland or Japan, but particularly in Japan, having a network and knowing people who recommend you to somebody else will always lead to something, whether it's a job, whether it's getting a contract in business. So I would say network, and there's lots of ways to do that. You can join the IJCC. You can talk to Irish companies who are operating in Japan. They're always looking for people. particularly people who have experience of being in Japan previously or have the language. And it's quite easy to reach out to those as well. So the response really is make yourself known and network, will be my response. So I don't know if anybody else on the panel wants to add to that one.
I think you nailed it there, Pat.
Okay, perfect. There's quite a few questions on language, and they all boil down to one thing. I suppose, is the language necessary? And there's a specific question about, is N2 Japanese a must for working in a Japanese company? So maybe, Sarah, do you want to answer that? But I think everybody on the panel will have opinions on that, different or the same, I'm not sure.
Well, I think if you're like an expat, then I think Japanese is not really essential. But if you are, because when you're here, like a lot of Japanese people see you as you being here for short term, and they will adjust and speak English to you. But if you would like to live here and work here long term, and especially if you're working for a Japanese company, then I think it definitely opens up opportunities within the company if you want to move up in the company. Because if you can have if you speak Japanese, you'll have a better understanding of the business culture and be able to develop relationships and with other colleagues and clients at a deeper level. So I mean, I didn't speak Japanese for 3 to 4 years. It wasn't until I really started, until after the earthquake, when a lot of as I mentioned earlier, a lot of my friends left. So I then immersed myself just in Japanese, in the culture and the language, and just surrounded myself with Japanese people. So I just slowly started learning the language. And after I started to learn the language, it was like a new world kind of opened up for me. So it was like as if I had 2 complete different experiences, and it definitely helps if you do have the language and if you want to develop your career here long term.
Very good.
I have also worked for Bacardi international companies too, but you will find that even if there are global companies here, that they do kind of expect you to speak Japanese and appreciate if you do learn the language. Thank you.
Okay. You were coming in there, Joe.
Yeah, I might jump in to just give a little slant, and this is speaking as someone who can speak Japanese, and I got the N2 and I use Japanese every day. But at the same time, if a situation requires someone to speak perfect Japanese, then it will usually be a Japanese person who will take on that role. And so in terms of the level that you should aim for, or the competency that you need, I think as good as possible. But unless you're going to be a translator or an interpreter, it's more about how you can use your language. And for a long time, I was very focused on the kanjis. But now what is really useful for me is being able to stand up in front of 100 people and not be nervous and speak Japanese, which is really difficult, and it's something that's very separate from passing the JLPT. So I would think about practicing your Japanese competency rather than aiming towards a particular JLPT level, whether that is, and as John mentioned, Japanese emails, absolutely crucial. But also, you're not going to learn it unless if you practice it. So practice the specifics of Japanese emails, practice interviews and business meetings, and how to read a newspaper, that kind of thing. So yeah, just to give that kind of slant on it, that would be my view.
Okay, any more questions from the floor? Okay, if we don't, I'll just go for one more from the registration process. So
there's one there from Paul. I think Paul has his hand up there.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm Paul. I'm working as a CIR at the moment in Wakayama. So I just wanted to ask, I'm not sure if the panel will have that much experience with it, but in terms of working in companies in Japan, both, I suppose, especially in the private sector, in Japanese companies and international companies, do you find that they kind of follow this Japanese cultural standard of overtime and working hours and, I suppose, holiday leave and that kind of thing? Because it's something that I think, like, foreigners, when we come to work here, we worry a lot about whether there's going to be a lot of pressure put on us to work overtime, like some of your Japanese colleagues might do.
Who wants to take that?
I could probably jump in on that. I think there's actually there's a book called The Blue-Eyed Salaryman. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's worth it. Really, it's quite short. But basically, the thing I'd say is, as a foreigner, you kind of have to set yourself up as just a little bit different. And, you know, you got to set your stall out that you're not going to be that guy who's there until 12 o'clock every night. And actually, you don't have to be. You know, the people who are there are not actually being that productive necessarily. So, like, what I've found working in, you know, as I say, an accounting firm, which is a big international name, but it's actually very, very Japanese culture, is you're going to find your niches. There's certain niches where you're going to fit in really well. And you're going to be able to contribute a lot. And if you find those niches, then you're not expected to be a Japanese person. You're not expected to be the same as everyone else. You know, you find your own way to contribute, and then people will accept you as you are. You know, and I was also thinking with the earlier question about, like, the best and worst thing. Like, you know, one of the worst things about a Japanese company can be actually, well, from a Japanese person's point of view, it might be the best, but the hierarchy, you know, and the very kind of set kind of career path that's there, where you can't really jump around and you can't kind of set yourself apart. But actually, as a foreigner, you can kind of set yourself apart and find a niche. So you've just got to not get sucked into the mindset that you have to be exactly the same. So that would be my advice if you want to avoid that fate.
Anybody else want to add to that? Go ahead, Oliver.
Oliver, you're on mute there.
Yeah. You're on
Oliver?
mute. Oliver, yeah. You're on mute. Thanks.
Oh, sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah. It depends very much on the company you're working at, but not only the company, would depend very much as well on the department within the company you're working at. And it could very much depend on the section manager or the even the smaller section within that department. But for example, now for us at Toyota Tsusho, we're actually, I would say, not very Japanese at all. Japanese in inverted commas, insofar as you know, the reputation that Japan got in the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. And just to give you some very, very practical examples, not to bore you with the rules and regulations of our company, etc. But we were forced to take our holidays. We're forced to take our summer vacation, which is separate from our annual leave. We're also not allowed to stay at work past a certain hour unless we have a special authorization from the boss. They've put a lot of time and effort into, especially now because of coronavirus, into working at home, into trying to reduce our burden as much as possible. So lots of people now, they just go into the office maybe, you know, at the moment it's once a week, but I remember between March and June, I didn't go in once. And that, you know, there still are a few horror stories that you might hear now and then, but modern Japanese companies which are well known, I think that day is long gone.
I was probably a bit harsh there, Oliver, you're right. I wouldn't have wanted to give the impression that everyone was doing that, yeah. No, it's a really good point, yeah.
I think I'm just going to interrupt a little bit. But it depends on the industry too. I mean, my industry, for example, of course, we have set working hours. So since COVID hit, we've been allowed to work remotely, which is great. But often you do have to put in a lot of work hours after work, and you know, being in the alcohol industry as well, we have to go out a lot with clients and go and visit customers, which can often end in late nights and then early starts as well. So it can be quite traditional. You know, it's still a very traditional kind of industry in some ways, which require a lot of relationship building outside of your work hours. But now again, this is changing with the current situations in moving in a better, more healthier way of working, I think.
Thanks, Sarah. Anybody want to add to that, or will we move on to maybe one final question?
I think one of the questions we had actually was about working in Japan as a woman. I suppose just following on from what you were saying there, Sarah, was there anything you want to add which is particular to working as a woman in Japan?
I don't think it's a lot different from working as a foreign man in Japan, to be honest with you. And I can't really answer as for Japanese women, but as a foreign woman, it can be quite challenging at first, especially about there is gender inequality in the workplace, but I think that is the same globally. But I think once you've kind of like established yourself here, as I think I've mentioned, and really proved to your colleagues, so you're a very hard worker and very dedicated, then I think as soon as you earn that kind of trust, it can be very rewarding to work here. Yeah, I guess that's my answer.
Thanks for that, Sarah. And I think it's like any job. I think there's an expectation that you have to prove yourself at the start as well, I think. And sometimes that requires you to understand and work out how you can, as John mentioned, kind of
important, but also the culture and their way of working, the ethic here. I think that's really very important too. So if they see you're very mindful and very much, your way of approaching work is you're being mindful of their way of working and adjusting yourself and adapting yourself to that, then I think it's you almost become very much accepted and not necessarily looked at as a foreigner or woman. You're just another part of the team.
Yeah, very good. We have a question there just that is asking to what extent are you in contact with your previous JET colleagues and groups? Sam, maybe if you want to go for that, anybody can answer it really.
Sure. Thanks, Pat. I'm still in touch quite a lot, actually. And so I said earlier, and COVID, after they stopped the state of emergency and we were allowed to travel between prefectures, I actually worked for Meenan for about a month. I went home, back to Meenan, and that was great. So I think, touching on my point earlier on about keeping that connection with the inaka, with Japanese countryside, I think it's really a good way to balance yourself, and having that connection through the JET program it's really quite unique. Having that opportunity to live and be fully immersed in a community like Ray. I mean, I think that's amazing that you got to live on those islands. I love Coastal Shima. I go there a lot. But anyways, yeah, having that is really special. I think being able to keep that connection is really useful as you develop your career in Japan.
Anybody else want to also?
I agree, Sam. I'm still the people I met on the islands are still some of my best friends, and I'm still in touch with most of the people I knew back then. And some of the people who were in their 20s and 30s now have their own children who are suddenly getting married, and I knew them as sort of babies. They're now actually getting married, having their own babies. So the connection it's fantastic, absolutely brilliant. And some of the students I used to teach, I'm so in touch with them. And actually a couple of them have said to me they've actually ended up marrying foreigners. And the reason they ended up marrying foreigners is I was the first sort of foreigner they met and exposed to. So they blame me for that.
Yeah, I think we didn't talk much about the impact that the JETs have on the students themselves. I think it's huge. And maybe is anybody else want to give a quick comment on that? The impact that you feel you've had on the students or on your community if you were a CIR? Nobody?
Yeah, I can say that I'm
Thanks, Joe.
not in touch, but after finishing up, many students added me on Facebook, and I see them in pictures in Canada and America and New Zealand, and working in these mad international jobs and typing up English posts, and it's incredible because they're like, you know, that they're doing it. And I wouldn't say that was because of me, but they went that direction, and it was for some of them like totally unexpected to see that happen. So if I could have moved to the future and saw that, it would have inspired me even more to try even harder while I was on JET. So yeah, that has been really cool.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's overlooked, because I'm sure, Joe, it was because of you that they made that decision, you know, to do things and to spread their wings a bit. Because my sister-in-law is a teacher in a high school in northern Japan as well, and she's always talking about the impacts that the ALTs have on the students, and it changes their the way of looking at things as well. So I think it's something that's overlooked a bit. I'll take one final question if we have one from the floor. If not, we'll move on. Or if there's any final comments from any of our panelists that you'd like to finish with, or you felt you didn't get a chance to talk about, feel free. No? Okay. So just to the rest of the evening, just to give you a kind of a brief rundown of what we'll do next. In the events that we have, we usually have a breakout session. There's functionality on Zoom that allows us to break out into separate rooms of 4 or 5 people, and we can have a 10-minute introduction to each other in a chat. It's kind of a virtual networking. If you haven't done it before, it's fairly straightforward. There's no pressure to do it, but it is a good way to start your networking journey if you haven't already. We'll do that because we're running behind. We'll do that for about 10 minutes, and we'll come back to the central room again, and we can decide then if we do a second. We usually do 2 of these. But prior to that, we'll ask Tsuchiya-san, the president of the IJCC, to say a few words.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Tsuchiya-san.
Yeah, welcome to IJCC networking event, what we were and what we became. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Yoshihiro Tsuchiya, president of IJCC. I used to work in Ireland in Dublin from 2010 to 2013, and I really enjoyed the life and the stay there. And then I fell in love with Ireland and Irish people after that. And so that, because of that, as soon as I came back to Japan, I immediately joined IJCC. And after that, I have been continuously involved in IJCC activities, and also some St. Patrick's activities called the I Love Ireland Festival. But anyway, thank you so much I would like to sincerely thank all ex-JET speakers, Sam-san, Sarah-san, Ray-san, Joe-san, Owen-san, and John-san. Your all speech was very, very interesting and useful, and I think it's very informative for all the participants tonight, especially I've never been to Kozushima and the Nijima, which the story was very interesting, and I would love to go to Kozushima or Nijima in future sometimes. And as you can learn from them tonight, JET program has always been very important and useful system to develop talented Irish people to contributing to Japan-Ireland relationship. And IGCC would like to support JET and the ex-JET or even pre-JET people by providing various opportunities of networking and webinars in future. Especially we found that we can reach more Irish people easily in various regions and connect people by online events. So as Pat-san mentioned, we, even after the COVID-19 situation improve, we would like to continue online events to reach various Irish community in Japan and even outside Japan. And finally, I do hope you have enjoyed this event so far, and please enjoy the breakout room part afterwards for networking. Thank you for joining us tonight. Arigatou gozaimashita.
Thank you very much, Tsuchiya-san. And just before we go into the Emiko is working on getting us ready for the breakout room. So if you haven't experienced it before, you may think you're being disconnected, but you won't. You'll just transition into a room. Prior to that, I might just talk a small bit about some kind of upcoming events with the IJCC and just the IJCC in general. As Tsuchiya-san mentioned, we are doing a lot more events now which involve international participants and regional participants. So we'd encourage anybody who wishes to join the Chamber to join. We have a new associate international membership which allows international members to attend the events. And we are also going to continue online events after we get back to face-to-face events as well. Also, as part of that, I mentioned the mentorship program. That's particularly relevant. Actually, mentoring and mentorship is relevant for anybody of any stage in their career. But I'm sure it would be very helpful for students, JET participants who are looking to change their career. So that's part of the membership package. So I'd encourage you to look at that as well. If you don't become a member, you can still join up for our newsletter and follow us and like us on social media. The more following and the more likes we get, etc., on social media, the more awareness of what the IJCC does. And finally, then we intend to expand the kind of activity around some of our committees, and we would love people to join and become part of some of those committees. If you're part of a committee, then you get actively involved with other members, and it's another great way to network. And then there's a couple of upcoming events. I think I mentioned one previously. We have an event with the Tales from the Regions. We have Rachel Meenan, who's on this call today. Rachel is going to give us an update on Shizuoka and Fukuroi, and we'll have the ambassador and the mayor. Other events, free team or on LinkedIn. That's really I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Toyoko In, who without Toyoko In and without the membership, we wouldn't be able to continue with all of these events. So thank you for that. So